the chaos in Latin America and Donald Trump and the operation in Venezuela. How, looking at what has happened in Venezuela, kidnapping the president of Venezuela and bringing that to the United States, and they have, they said, they have many accusations against the president of Venezuela. I don't know if those accusations would be, you know, anybody would care about those accusations in the international community. But after all, Donald Trump has decided to do that. What is your understanding of the final equation on the part of the United States, and why was that a successful operation in the eyes of the Trump administration?
Well, you're asking me, Nima, to discuss it from the US point of view, whereas I'm sitting in the Russian position, and we'll talk about the Russian Chinese interpretation of what's happened. Um, so I'm going to focus what I have to say in answer uh, to how the Russian side thinks of this. And first of all, and in a principled way, um, several points to begin with, uh, taking into account that there's much that we don't know. And much of the Russian commentary to date, the press commentary, the statements by former President Dmitry Medvedev, and so on, indicate that for the time being, there's no clarity on the Russian side of exactly what's happened. For example, is this a putsch in Caracas or a snatch? That is to say, we've seen over the last few hours in statements from President Trump and those accompanying him on his aircraft back from Miami to Washington, a number of statements. In the first place, they believe that force, their force, is unmatched in the world. And yet they've demonstrated it uh, against apparently almost no defense. That's to say, their mobile anti aircraft and anti missile batteries were not mobile, they were fixed, left in place, and knocked off easily. Second, they only took President Maduro and his wife. I've yet to see any photographic evidence of his wife, but let's allow that we believe that they've taken them both. They appear to have killed the Cuban bodyguard, 32 Cuban dead, according to the Cuban side, and up to 80 Venezuelans killed during the air attacks, the missile rocket bombing air attacks. Uh, but they've only taken Maduro. Now, maybe the folks at home, and certainly the white supremacists around President Trump, didn't read Uncle Remus. They don't know of the story of the tar baby. The tar baby is a strategy told in that story in which Brer Rabbit um, attacks a tar baby placed in a thicket by the clever Brer Fox who wants to eat the rabbit. The rabbit is offended when the tar baby doesn't respond to the rabbit's questions. And so the rabbit loses his temper and starts to strike the tar baby. Every time he hits the tar baby, he gets stuck more clearly in the thicket and is captured, therefore, by the wily fox. Now, the story ends up somewhat differently if you can go on. But is this a tar baby operation? The US has taken out Maduro as the head of a regime, but left in place Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president, acting president. And the US has now announced, and this is almost as important as snatching Maduro and taking him to New York, they've dumped Ms. Machado. They have dumped the Venezuelan opposition forces as contenders for an immediate election. They have basically said, and it's the one and most significant truth that Trump has said in his press conferences lately, there's no respect in Venezuela for Machado. She can't win an election. So the operation now is taking the shape of the United States seeking to make a deal with uh, Vice President Rodriguez with the intact defense ministry and defense minister, the intact interior ministry, which runs the popular militia. In other words, the self defenses and military defenses of the country, in order to manage a transition, and a transition in which the United States says it will take back its oil, reversing constitutional and other forms of nationalization, which are still subject to compensation claims uh, by Chevron and ExxonMobil. So you've got a snatch of an individual without a change of regime. You've got no occupation with the intention to occupy the oil field concessions. And thereby, you've got an attack on those who hold those concessions, both the Venezuelan National Oil Company, the Russians who've invested about $17 billion, principally oil and gas, and even more, obviously, the Chinese side, which has invested in and has at stake here more than $70 billion worth of assets. Now, in that sense, the US has struck at the tar baby and bought itself a long term fight, first of all, with inside Venezuela, with the existing Chavista regime. It's abandoned its long term opposition led attempt to the fifth column inside Venezuela to overthrow the regime. It's a snatch, not a regime change. And it's taken on China and Russia over the oil investment issue. And finally, it's taken on and mobilized not only Venezuelan voters, but Brazil, Cuba, Nicaragua, Mexico, Colombia, the group that has just issued a very clear condemnation. So it's taken a lot of new enemies. It's given considerable impetus to those ready to put up the kind of deterrent defense of sovereignty and self sufficiency, which Venezuela didn't put up over the night of January 2, January 3. So, from a Russian point of view, there are a number of messages here. The first is that no agreement with the United States is possible unless you have exerted sufficient force to deter your further US attack. And that's why we had referred to the not the non coincidence of the drone attack on President Putin's residence in the Novgorod region as a demonstration of projection of force against the president of Russia. And that, finally, Trump has now agreed was not a lie. Let's bear in mind that in all the press coverage, Trump has admitted there was a targeted attack on the Novgorod residency, the Dolgoye residence near Valdai of President Putin. Now Trump is saying it was near his house, a military facility, according to CIA. Well, the military facility there is a nuclear command control bunker. So between a an attack on the Russian presidency, like an attack on the Venezuelan presidency, an attack on the nuclear command control system. These are very, very grave attacks on Russian sovereignty. And so we can go on in our discussion of what the implications are. But just to go back, was this a putsch or a snatch? Is the result a tar baby operation, which ultimately works to the disadvantage and entrapment of the attacker, the United States, in this game? Is this an attack on Chinese and Russian investment? Approximately 70 plus 16, 17 billion, about $87 billion worth of combined Russian Chinese assets. And what are the Russians going to do about it? What are the Chinese going to do about it? These are all the issues we have now in the wake of what happened.
John, you remember before attack on Iran, we had an attack on Russian nuclear bombers, similar to
Yes,
what has happened in Iran. And right
yes,
now, before the attack on Venezuela, we had an attack on Putin's residence in
yes.
Russia. Every time it seems that Russia is part of the game. Every time they attack on Iran, on Venezuela, and I don't know what is the perception on the part of the Russian government today, because Donald Trump, as you've mentioned, he said that look at what we've done in Venezuela. This is the force, this is the power. And look at what Russia is doing in Ukraine for 4 years. They're doing nothing.
Exactly so. And Trump rubbed it in. I'm just looking down at my papers so I can read you exactly what Trump has said. In the initial press conference in Mar-a-Lago, announcing that the from the U.S. point of view, the military triumph of all its forces in Caracas, Trump was asked about his current communications with President Putin and the Ukraine war. President Putin was the only one uh, against the only other foreign leader, if I'm not mistaken, that Trump attacked during that press conference. So he said, he referring to the previous telephone conversation, Trump said, I'm not thrilled with Putin. I'm not thrilled with Putin. He's killed too many people. He then went on to say, and this answers directly your question, asked about the war in the Ukraine, he said, I inherited that war. That was Joe Biden, Zelensky, and Putin. I'm quoting. I came into the situation, it's a mess. I'll say this. I watched an operation last night that was so precise, so brilliant. I mean, it was incredible. If we had our people, like this general, he's referring to General Kane, chief of the general staff, uh, Joint Chiefs of Staff, and our people involved, that war would not have gone on very long. I can tell you that's a deliberate challenge. How come President Putin has not ended his war in the Ukraine? If the US had been involved, it would be over very quickly. Well, that's military boasting, yes. It's not the case that the US military are all fools and dunderheads. It's not the case that the European allies are all fools and dunderheads. It's the case that the US and the allies believe that they mounted sufficient force to defeat Russia on the Ukraine battlefield, and they're being defeated, but slowly, very slowly. So what's happened here is a wake up call to Russia. It's a wake up call to China. And there's more for Russia, just as you said. When Trump has been discussing on the plane back to Washington from Mar-a-Lago, there's a lot of revealing discussion with him, um, Secretary of Commerce Lutnick, and others who all identify new US targets. And one of them's Greenland. Why Greenland? It's not really a US operation against Denmark, though the Danes, the loyal warriors for US purposes against Russia in Europe. It's an attack, a coming attack on on the Russian new oil transportation link through the Arctic. Oil and gas through the Arctic is the Russian, Chinese, Indian alternative to the Suez Canal, the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean Channel. It's another attempt to make war against Russia and isolate it and block off all its capacity to trade and survive. So the Greenland focus is another attack long term against Russia in the trade world. So each one of these moves is a US challenge to what the US is saying is Russian weakness. They've also said through the Novgorod attack, just as we knew exactly where Maduro was when we struck him, we know exactly where President Putin is putting down his head to rest in Russia. And if we want, we can attack you, take you, kidnap you, or kill you. This is a display of force, which obviously is triggering very significant reassessment on the Russian side of what value negotiating with Trump and the US over the Ukraine war, what value it has. What value do any of Trump's assurances since the Alaska summit, what value do they have? And going forward, what value does US security guarantees have for Russia in the Ukraine? Continuation of war, more threats, more exhibitions of what the US believed to be its effective violence. So these are all warning issues that the Russian side's now got to digest. So, what's the Russian side about to do? What is the Chinese side about to do? We'll come to that in a minute.
But do you, on the Russian side, do you think the way that Maduro was removed from power in Venezuela, how do they think about the future of Venezuela without Maduro? Is that going to be a very drastic change in the path toward the future for the foreign policy, for the domestic policy of Venezuela, or Russia doesn't see that much of change coming to Venezuela?
Well, this is it's a very good question, Nima, and I'll come exactly to what Foreign Minister Lavrov said on this matter, since he has now the lead in Moscow. Uh, but there's a display of Russia not knowing exactly what has happened in Caracas. To go back to the point, uh, was it a putsch, a regime change, or was it a snatch to remove one element of the Chavista government, but leave in place all the other elements? There is clearly from Russian statements no indication that the Russian side accepts that there's been regime change. So let me come to Foreign Minister Lavrov's statement. It's an important one, which he made in the afternoon of January 3. I'll just read, I'm looking at it so I can read it exactly. At 1729 Moscow time, so before Delcy Rodriguez spoke to Secretary of State Rubio in the United States, Foreign Minister Lavrov said he'd had a telephone conversation with Delcy Rodriguez Gomez. Lavrov expressed, and I'm quoting, firm solidarity with the people of Venezuela, firm solidarity with the people of Venezuela confronting an armed aggression. No doubt what he means there. Then Russia will keep supporting, that's continuous tense, keep supporting the policy of the Bolivarian government, that's the one in place, to protect the country's national interests and sovereignty. The officials, meaning Lavrov and Rodriguez, spoke against further escalation so as to find a solution via dialogue. During the conversation, the two expressed mutual commitment to bolster up comprehensive strategic partnership between Russia and Venezuela. Now, one can interpret that in a number of ways, but it's very clear that it's an indication that Lavrov is saying we have not abandoned the Chavista government in Venezuela. can I compare it to what the Chinese have said? Because it's profoundly different. I'll just read you, as I reach over for the papers, what President Xi said in a meeting with the Prime Minister of Ireland. Xi said, and listen to how different this is. Quotes, great powers, this is President Xi of China talking, should take the lead in respecting the development path chosen by other countries. The world's going through unprecedented change and turbulence, and Xi attacked hegemonic unilateralism that severely undermines the international order. He then said to the Prime Minister of Ireland that China and Ireland should, quote, strengthen coordination and cooperation on global issues. Now, several things are rather clear there. First, he didn't say what China is actually going to do, and didn't express solidarity with the Venezuelan government. He fell short of doing that. Foreign Minister Lavrov was clear. Second, Xi said that to the Prime Minister of Ireland when he knows perfectly well, I've got to calm my tone here, that Ireland has taken the position of the NATO alliance against Russia on the Ukraine. How come the president of China, in his strategic relationship with Russia, should speak of cooperation with Ireland when Ireland has taken the US NATO side against Russia? Had he forgotten that? Impossible. Then the foreign minister of China made a statement that's not all that different. Wang Yi said, in speaking after meetings with Pakistani officials, Beijing cannot accept any country acting as the world's judge. Quotes, we've never believed that any country can act as the world's police, nor do we accept that any nation can claim to be the world's judge. Pious words. Exactly what level of military force does China, or what level of economic and financial commitment does China propose to use against what they've said has happened? Are they speaking of pious morality, or do they actually believe they're prepared to do something? And at that moment, the Chinese are saying this to Pakistan, which launched a war through terrorists against India and was defeated, and in a war in which China's position strategically with Pakistan was defeated, in which China's weaponry, anti defense, aircraft, and all the forms of command control the Chinese had invested in Pakistan had been defeated by India. And Pakistan has turned against China towards the United States. So China is trying to repair its position with Pakistan while posing as a defender of international law and order. And it's speaking from a position of demonstrable military weakness. So, just to go back, where's Lavrov's position here? He's saying we're supporting our investment and in solidarity with the Bolivarian Revolution. This is to line Russia with Brazil, Nicaragua, Cuba, and Mexico and Colombia. And does that mean that Russia's prepared to add to its force in deterring the United States from the kind of operation it pulled in Caracas a few days ago? That remains to be seen. But the Chinese approach has to be understood to be empty and said in the wrong contexts. Xi saying it to one of the NATO allies against Russia, Ireland, and Wang Yi saying it to Pakistan, which has used terrorism against India, Russia's ally. The Chinese are making a nonsense of their own power. They are acting as paper tigers. Obviously, Foreign Minister Lavrov is very sensitive to, to criticism that Russia acted the paper tiger when the Turks, principally, but also Israel and the United States, overthrew the Assad regime in Syria, December 2024. And Russia is also sensitive to criticism that it failed to do enough to deter the Israeli American attack on Iran. So here we have an attempt by Foreign Minister Lavrov to say, we're going to do more. And I put a question mark in my voice there. Are we, the Russian side, going to do more for the people of Venezuela confronting an armed aggression using Lavrov's words? What exactly is meant by bolster up comprehensive strategic partnership between Russia and Venezuela? This is a much more explicit commitment by Russia. It's a commitment by the foreign minister leading. President Putin has said nothing as yet on the matter. Uh, and it's a blow against that faction inside Russia that thinks you can do a deal with Russian business, the very individuals who are now actively talking about seizing Russian oil concessions in Venezuela and making it taking it back for Chevron, ExxonMobil, and the others. So uh, I think that summarizes the range of answers I'd give. The Chinese are playing paper tiger here. Russia is trying not to exceed its capacity to project force. It's saying a number of things to the United States. And both sides are not apparently not exactly clear what exactly has happened in Caracas to the Bolivarian government. It's minus Maduro, but what else? That's a question that hasn't been answered yet. And it's clear Lavrov is attempting to say we're going to do business with a Chavista government that remains, with acting President Rodriguez. We're going to act in solidarity with Cuba, Brazil, and others, the BRICS members of the Latin American group, and so on. But what exactly the lesson is for resisting another Caracas attack, that's what Russia is going to demonstrate on the Ukraine battlefield now.